members of the faculty, and dignitaries who have joined us from across the nation, along with the members of the audience. I, Dipanshu Agarwal, Director of the NUJS Center for Criminal Law, Criminology, and Victimology, would like to take the privilege of welcoming you all on the behalf of the entire NUJS fraternity to a very special panel discussion on the theme of line between hate speech and free speech. In this discussion, we'll be focusing on the topic whether the speech, right to free speech, has been blurred by chance or intentionally. The need to have an academic discussion on this contemporary relevant topic had become imminent as we approach the celebration of 75th year of our nation becoming independent and 72 years since the enactment of our own constitution. Our constitution has been premised on the ideas of liberty, integrity, and freedom. But as George Orwell remarked, if liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. However, what does this freedom of speech imply? And to what limits does it extend? The recent incidents in our own country and as well as across the globe has compelled us to reflect on this very idea of free speech. Right to offend. Right to offend. Oh, wait a second. Right to offend versus right restrictions of free speech based on other people taking offense constitutes the core of this discussion. In this discussion, we'll be reflecting on the constitutional ideas of free speech from the perspective of human rights, political evolution, index civilization, and global acceptance. The discussion also aims to foster an academic discourse on the limitations of free speech and its intersection with ideas of hate speech, with the penal provisions like blasphemy, which revolve around hurting sentiments through speech. This discussion is very important to take place in a law school sphere, as some elements of global democracy attempt to water down some legal provisions which allegedly infringe the right to free speech, but on the other hand also call for the increasing the restrictions on free speech. For this discussion, we have a very special panel. Firstly, we have Advocate J.Sai Deepak sir. Sir is an advocate of Supreme Court and is also the author of the book of a very renowned book, India That Is Bharat. In this book, he has explicitly focused on Indic civilization and constitution. We also have Professor Dr. Rajiv Vargav sir. He was an ex-professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He is also leading the Lokniti team and he was also the former member of the CSDS. We also have Ms. Maja Daruwala ma'am. Ma'am has been an extensive academician throughout her life. She has also she has written about it, and she is also a former advisor member of Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and she was also the chief editor of Indian Justice Report. In the panel, we also have Mr. Rajkamal Jha, the editor-in-chief of the Indian Express, one of the largest leading dailies of India. And the discussion will be moderated by Mr. Avantik Tamda sir. He's the guest faculty for International Human Rights Law at NUJS, and he's also assistant professor at Jindal Global Law School and visiting assistant professor at NLSIU Bangalore. We are hopeful that the discussion will resolve the constructive discourse among right to free speech, as well as remark the difference between hate speech and free speech vis-a-vis blasphemy, constitutional provisions, and criminal law provisions. Now I'd like to request Avantik sir to please take over. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Dipanshu, and a very warm welcome to all our panelists as well as the audience. It's not very often that we see such a large gathering on a Saturday afternoon, beg your pardon. And that is for great purpose, of course. And we are here to have a provocative discussion on the idea of where does my privilege of free speech, or rather the right of free speech, end, and where are the contours specifically of the constitutional privilege which is accorded to me by various provisions of the law, as well as the practices which the polity has bestowed upon its citizens. Now, when Dipanshu came to me with this topic, and the topic is very ingeniously sort of timeline with the idea line between free speech and hate speech blurred by chance or by intent. And I was reminded of Articles 18 and 19 of the ICCPR, which specifically harp on the very importance of the idea of free speech as well as the right of freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, and how they are limited by two specific requirements of there has to be a law and there has to be the requirement being absolutely necessary. And I mean, Article 18 has a particular clauses which requires that it must be necessary for various purposes. And so does Article 19, and this is further qualified by General Comment 34. But I will not cloak the opinion of the audience before we've heard the panelists. So the format which we are going to follow is, of course, I will be introducing the panelists, and we will wait for an opening remark from the panelists before we engage in certain discussion amongst ourselves before we further open the floor for questioning. So I'm not going to get into the difficult tasks of prioritizing which panelist to call first and which panelist to call second. We'll follow the alphabetical order, and Professor Bhargava comes first. And Professor Bhargava, of course, needs no introduction, but for the sake of familiarity with the audience, I will just introduce Professor Bhargava. Professor Rajiv Vargav is a professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi. He has been a professor at the Center for Political Studies at GNU, and he was the head of the Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi. He is a professorial fellow at the Institute of Social Justice in Sydney and an honorary fellow at Balliol College, Oxford. He has been a fellow at Harvard University, the University of Bristol, the Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, the Institute of, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that, this institute in Berlin, and there is a plethora of other universities as well as institutes which he constantly remains associated with. That is the brilliance of the name which Professor Bhargava carries with his academic eminence as well as excellence. Now, Professor Bhargava's publications require a list of publications which will be published, of course, in a journal. That is the number of publications.
And all our time talking about the panelists. I think we should get to the issue.
Let's get to the discussion. As Professor Bhargava has just allowed me, this is Professor Bhargava, and we are waiting to hear from him. Professor, this is your floor.
So I actually, I'd like to begin with the Emperor Ashoka. And this is not constitutionalism. The whole discourse of Ashoka on speech is not in the framework of rights, but it makes eminent sense to me. He makes three major points. One is that if two religio-philosophical communities, two or more religio-philosophical communities are living face to face, and they are very different from each other, they are bound to dislike certain things that other communities practice or views that other communities hold. Now, what are they supposed to do when they dislike those things? I think Ashoka says that they should not keep it to themselves. They should be explicit about these disagreements. They should come out in the open and say whatever it is that they have in their mind to their, well, I won't call them adversaries, but certainly people who differ from them. But do so only on three conditions. One, that they have good reason. B, that the occasion is appropriate. And C, that the tone is moderate. So please go ahead and criticize the other, but do so only when you have good reason to, when you have the right kind of occasion for it, and do so moderately. I think this makes eminent sense. This also makes a distinction between hate speech and free speech. It makes a distinction between anything that is bound to insult or someone and criticism. So there is a distinction between genuine criticism, open expression of disagreement, and offending and insulting people. Now, your question is that sometimes the line is very thin. And Here, I would give the benefit of the doubt to those who are speaking out against others, particularly, and here the political bit is very important. I would give absolute freedom to those who are powerless to speak to the powerful in any tone, and blurring the line between criticism and offense. I don't think people who are powerful should be too touchy about criticism coming to them. On the other hand, the reverse doesn't hold. People who are powerful should be a little more sensitive to those who are powerless, whether it is the poor or the deprived, or even groups in smaller number. I think there should be some people should take care in offending them, because they are already very vulnerable in some senses. So this is the broad way. This is kind of a broad sort of picture that I have of free speech, and of course, if we were translated into the constitutional language of right to free speech and what it is that should be criminalized and not, I would say that every society has a background understanding of what is and what is not going to cause deep offense to others. And I think they should use common sense and not do certain things which other people will find hurtful, deeply hurtful. On the other hand, as I said, criticism is absolutely fine in certain contexts. I'm talking about people making inflammatory speeches, or particularly when the atmosphere in the country is not peaceful, when there is hostility around us. I think everybody should exercise a lot of self-restraint, and anybody who doesn't, and if that person does make speech that has an intent that has the intention of deeply hurting, given the history of certain groups, there are certain things that these groups don't want to hear, and I think there is no necessity in repeating those things which are going to cause hurt to other people. So I think that if they openly advocate enmity, incite people, the usual things about how they create any sense of estrangement between groups, if they disturb social peace and what in Asia we generally call harmony, I think they should be prevented from doing so. And if there is no other remedy but legal prevention, then perhaps, at the last instance, legally also, they should be prevented. I can't hear you.
I'm so sorry. There's a technical glitch, and of course, these are very well made points. And in fact, the takeaway from this is that Professor Vargav already mentions that criticism must be done in a tone of sobriety, and if it is not, perhaps it is intended to cause enmity and disturb the communal harmony which exists between groups. So that is the takeaway from this, and of course, we'll return back to it. But we have Ms. Daruwala coming next, and Ms. Daruwala is a senior advisor at the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative.
You already said.
I already said. Humility is ma'am's middle name, and ma'am needs no introduction. This is ma'am having the floor to her.
Thank you. When I was in Africa, they had a lovely way of doing things, which I would deeply commend to you, which is right at the beginning of these kinds of meetings, they would say, all protocols observed, and then carry on. So which is just lovely, the lovely way of doing it. We all know who we are, and enough already. Okay. What do I have as opening remarks? One is that I think that we talk about hate speech. Free speech we take for granted, those of us who are used to using it, and we want to protect it. But on the point of hate speech, there is no firm, specific definition in a country which goes by statutory law. Instead, there are these surrogates for penalizing things that people don't like in terms of blasphemy, defamation, sedition, incitement to violation, outraging somebody's religious moralities, etc. So, and this allows for a set of imprecisions to enter both in judicial interpretation as well as in brute implementation and restrictiveness under the grounds that someone is being hurt. We are not yet clear, even if you go through all the law right from the beginning, from 1957 right down to now, we are not clear about either the parameters of the content or the consequences that should flow. And I would like to add later on about what I feel that the law, those who are the protectors of law and constitution, which is the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary, how timid they have been about ensuring that free speech holds the ground. You will see that right from the beginning, depending on the context which Professor Vargav spoke about, you will see the courts either constraining or expanding what free speech should be. And one can understand that in terms of sedition, etc. But it also means that there is a whole level of subjectivity, right from who was hurt, whether it's an individual or a community, to the courts and how they interpret it. And this, of course, means that where you have authoritarian tendencies, etc., you can really destroy the ground level, what we take as assumed. We can really destroy it very quickly. I think I'd like to stop with that and say that with one other thing. I've spoken about free speech, but not everything that offends is hate speech. We use this word very loosely. You are hearing it in judgments where there is no rationale. You know, the person like me who is a lawyer wants to hear those 5 words or 2 paragraphs that clearly explain the objective value system or the objective tests by which you will define hate speech. And I'm not seeing this happen. Then at the same time, because the court is very rarefied and the ordinary society is listening to this again and again, media plays around in this space, sensationalizing and also making, what's the word I'm looking for? And mischief making, if you like. So the creation of sensation, the creation of emotion around these words, hate speech, adds to all this. And of course, we can talk at another moment about the way in which hate speech is actually actioned by the executive, or what is so-called known as hate speech. How much is brought into that basket to suit the state and those in power, and subsequently to prejudice our democracy and our rights.
Right. So we thank, ma'am, should we move to the next speaker? Is that your opening remark? Right. So that's something we take away from Ms. Daruwala's comments, that in fact, something which strikes me is not everything that offends is hate speech. The idea of subjectivity, which ma'am speaks of, is something we'll continue to return back to and maybe have this clarified. But we have our next speaker, and this is Advocate Sai Deepak, who is an engineer turned litigator, and like ma'am would want us to have all protocols absorbed for the greater clarity of this discussion. Let things be as they are, and Advocate Sai Deepak is our next speaker.
Sure. Thank you for giving me a space on this panel. I'm happy to share space with all these eminent dignitaries. I think the one thing that perhaps there is consensus on is the inherent subjectivity in this particular discussion. So perhaps what we're looking for is identification of factors and the kind of weightage that we would want to give to each of these factors to play around with the equation, so to speak, or construct an equation. There are 2 points that I would want to build on based on Dr. Bhargava's opening remarks and Ms. Daruwala's opening remarks, or Dr. Daruwala's opening remarks. One is, how do you frame free speech rules in the context of social equations, social transactions, and social debates? And then how do you superimpose the legal or the constitutional framework on this particular social transaction? Now, there are 2 or 3 things that I think I would want to spell out by way of considerations in no particular order, only so that there is some crystallization of the various variables here. One is, to some extent, as Dr. Bhargava says, the approach to free speech must be grounded in the history of a particular society. And therefore, the respective social equations or power equations, so to speak, I understand certainly have a place as far as this construct is concerned. That's point number 1. Point number 2 is, when we speak of free speech and hate speech, perhaps we could have 2 baskets. One is the statist basket and the second is the non-statist basket. So speech from the perspective of its exercise by state actors and speech from the perspective of its exercise by non-state actors. That's the second classification, so to speak. 3 is balancing of different forms of rights. 1, the right of the speaker to communicate and articulate his or her position. The right of a listener to want to consume that, and the right of another cross-section of listeners who want to proscribe that particular speech, in the process curtailing 2 rights. One is the right of the speaker, and one is the right of the members of the audience who would want to listen. Now, fortunately, Justice Nariman in Shreya Singhal recognizes very clearly that speech is a 2-way communication, and therefore you also have to consider its impact, or let's say impairment of free speech, and its impact on the listeners and the right of the audience to consume, which therefore equally applies to the right of readers. So we are not just looking at speech, we are looking at all forms of expression, broadly speaking. Then comes the question of whether you apply the intent rule or do you wish to apply the effects principle. Now, as far as the intent rule is concerned, here again, I don't think it's as easy, for the simple reason that, assume for a moment there is a positively rigorous commentary which is written on a particular faith system or a particular darshan or a philosophy with sufficient basis, and it is given all the trappings of an academic work. And then a politician chooses to read out that particular work in a particular tone as part of a particular speech delivered in a political context. So it's not just the question of the intent with which a particular work has been created by its primary author, but also how do you choose to use it subsequently and who uses it. Therefore, the setting or the context and the dramatis personae become equally relevant. But perhaps the easiest non-red line, so to speak, that could be drawn is what I think I completely agree with Dr. Darwala on, which is that not all offense can rise up to the level of hate speech. Soft sentiments cannot be the threshold or the barometer on the basis of which you decide the yardsticks of a particular discussion, especially when it comes to free speech. Now, then the question is, okay, if it's not a question of if the effects principle cannot be based entirely on the basis of somebody's hurt sentiments or perpetually hurt sentiments or outrage sentiments, then how do you try and do justice? One, I don't think the society or the state has the right to protect offended or potentially offended sentiments. I don't think anybody has that responsibility. You're looking at a transaction and a discussion between adults, and therefore, for all practical purposes, nobody has the obligation to protect offended sentiments or shield them from offense. All they could legitimately hope to be shielded from is a predictable and a reasonable nexus between a statement that is made and the possibility of it rising to the level of action against a particular individual or a group. So therefore, until it rises to the level of a call for action or just stops short of it, leaving the audience to do the rest, that is where perhaps the line is drawn with respect to hate speech. As I said, this is easier said than done. So the postulation of a principle is certainly much more easier than the application of it in a certain context. So obviously this would depend on a case-to-case basis. There is another element that needs to be considered, which is the right to humor, and therefore humorous free speech and spoof. Given that we live in an age of stand-ups, the question would be, at what point do you draw the line between spoof and humor, and using humor as a way of attacking a particular group or a community? Then, of course, is the most sensitive aspect, wherein elements in the media have their own either religious positions or ideological positions or political positions. Now, perhaps it's easier to go after state actors. It's even perhaps easier to go after non-media, non-state actors. But perhaps the most sensitive aspect would be what kind of restrictions can be placed on the media should it indulge in what amounts to clear hate speech. Now, while it seems natural to say that self-regulation must be the way forward here as far as the media is concerned, I would disagree for a very different reason, given the multiplier effect that the media can create, and given the kind of reach and power it has as far as the shaping of opinions and facts are concerned. And therefore, notwithstanding the fact that the fourth estate does play a clear role in the dissemination of news and information and whatnot, and clearly increasing the basket of political choices, I do not believe that media should get a free pass for merely being the media, particularly when it comes to hate speech. Now, the question is, if free speech is directly communicated by the media, that is very different from the media giving a certain platform for a particular opinion, wherein comes the question of exercise of editorial control. But how do you exercise editorial control in a live debate? How do you do that when the point is already made, the audience has already consumed it? It's as bad as asking the jury to disregard something that has already been said by a particular witness. They cannot remove it from the calculus once it is entered. You can't unsee it, you can't unhear it. So then are you looking at ex post facto deterrence? And in which case, how would those ex post facto deterrence exactly work? Because I think the scope for using free speech through the platform of a media to promote a certain ideology is not a relatively new phenomenon, but it is certainly an in-your-face phenomenon as on date. And I, for one, certainly don't believe that we live in an age of neutrality as far as the media is concerned. Now, the only thing perhaps where I may have a disagreement is I do not believe for a moment that numerical majority translates to power and numerical minority translates to lack of power. That is something that I'm not in a position to agree with, because that would be a function of history. And I don't think it's a question of numbers that determines the question of franchise. It's more a question of position. It's more a question of political importance. It's more a question of how you can game the system that determines your true strength and power, and not your numerical, let's say, superiority or inferiority, so to speak. And there are numerous examples to this effect, not just in Bharat, but in other places as well. So I think this would be my limited observation with respect to the various variables which perhaps come together to form an equation. I look forward to the opinion of Mr. Jha. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. In fact, so we found this really interesting opening conversation, which Mr. Deepak has guided us towards, that the history of freedom of speech must be sort of studied in the backdrop of the culture of that, the community which we're studying in. And of course, we have the dichotomies prevalent within the media unfolded before us. And this is perhaps the opportune moment to hear Mr. Jha, because Mr. Jha is also an engineer turned editor, and he is as much a part of the fourth estate as various luminaries who are a part of the panel as well as beyond. So Mr. Jha, the floor is yours.
Great. You know, it is so good to be the last speaker when you tend to agree with almost everything that has been said. So what I'll do is I'll just sort of, do a postscript kind of comments. And my view is the view from, as somebody who sits in a newsroom. And we have seen in the last 8 to 10 years the fact that media, the definition of media, is now so radically different from what it was when I joined the Indian Express. Sort of, the names I see on my screen here, each one of you with the phone that you have, bear witness, you post comments and pictures, and I'm sure the founding fathers had not factored this in. The fact that there can be a billion voices wanting to be heard at the same time, disagreeing, agreeing with each other, and in many cases not caring about that at all. So in that context, I just have a couple of thoughts and observations. And I agree with Dr. Bhargav, Ms. Maya Daruwala, and Mr. Deepak as well on the key points that they have made. That one, it is very difficult to draw the line between free speech and hate speech. And so why don't we do one thing and start off by saying, let's for a moment not draw the line. Free speech is basically, as a political philosopher said, that free speech today is the search engine we have for truth. When we know that truth is so contested, the way to reach it, we never reach the truth, but we do our best to reach as close to the truth as we can. And the way to do it is via free speech. That is the only way we have. If you go back, there are so many law students here, so I know you guys know this much better than I do, that most of the restrictions on Article 19 had a context. If you go back in the debate, the Hindu-Muslim partition riots brought certain restrictions on Article 19. The DMK and its talk of secession at one point brought a restriction. So if you look at the history of free speech in India, it has been restrained by so many contexts of that time. Now, we were lucky that there was a Kedarnath Singh in 1962, which kind of laid the benchmark on sedition, which we now know was not followed, is not followed at all, and until the court has to step in and say something. A couple of weeks ago, we know that Section 66, Deepak, who talked about that ruling, the Shreya Singhal ruling, it has been struck down. But we heard just again a couple of weeks ago, sort of a quote saying that it seems that nobody knows that we struck it down. So I think, I really miss a police officer on this panel. I would have loved to hear him or her say what constitutes an FIR. And I think that is the key issue. The key issue is what, as each of the speakers said, and there is no debate on the point of that thick red line between speech and, say, hate. That is hate speech. The issue with hate is it is such a strong, loaded word. Hate is we normally tell, school kids that, don't use the word hate. Say, I don't like it. Hate is very strong word. And it comes loaded with, as Deepak said, a lot of arcs of history, culture, contestation, which is not so easy as, as A or B or pro this or pro that. And there is no debate about the fact that, when speech incites, that, go and beat up somebody, there, I don't think there is much of a debate on what needs to be done. But truth, as always, is not so black and white. And that's what makes it very, very fascinating and at the same time frustrating, is that what is the benchmark of 153A? What is the benchmark for 505? What is the benchmark for 182, for 500, for 504? In my, where I sit in the Indian Express, I have a small piece of paper listing the sections of the Indian Penal Code under which one of my colleagues can be booked and taken away. And there are so many. And we don't know. We wake up in the morning and we don't know what constitutes, who will do the defining ruling on 124. We know there is one of 1962. We don't know what is the defining ruling on 505. What is the defining ruling on disaffection? And there will be none. So in that context, the only thing, one of the few things we can do, well, the first thing we can do is thicken our skin and learn to hold our nose. At the Indian Express, we have taken a fairly absolutist stand on free speech, given our history. There are many times we do an editorial where we do have to hold our nose, but we need to strongly defend free speech. Saying that there should be curbs, and we have all seen from history, curbs don't work. A curb on free speech, even if you see a country like Germany, which has very strong legal curbs on what it says is hate speech. Now, that hasn't curbed the rise of very strong groups that talk about hate against a certain group. So rules and regulations don't work. I think what works is giving each other the space. And I think every other speaker said the same thing, that we have to listen to the other people. We will not each one of us, given our own individual histories, will say something that will be interpreted as speech that somebody doesn't like. And we have to give each other space, number one. Number two, I think what really is the issue is weaponization of the law, which means essentially, where do you get the FIR? How do you arrest somebody for saying something or for a sketch? And the disturbing thing is that, and Deepak talked about the non-state actors, which is a very, very important point. If you see, most of the action that we see today is against school kids and college kids and individuals and a stand-up comic and somebody, and it cuts across all party lines. It is happening in a range of state governments. A cartoonist being picked up for a sketch against somebody who is in power. Where does that come from? What is that definition? So I think our task is cut out. Each one of us has a phone. We are a member of 1 million WhatsApp groups. The founding fathers did not know that one day there will be so many of us who want to be heard. And it's work in progress. There will be mistakes along the way. But I think the only way out is to listen and to give that space. Give that space, yeah, at 9 o'clock, of course, at 9 o'clock on television, but much, much more importantly, and at the risk of sounding like the old, we are all old panelists here except Mr. Deepak, is the space in our own personal groups and WhatsApp groups is to listen to people, even though we may not like it. And as we started the debate that Deepanshu and Avantik talked about, that don't mute anybody. If they want to mute themselves, sort of help them unmute, but we should hear them out. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jha. So I'm going to quickly throw open a question to all of our panelists, and this is going to be a provocative question taking on from Mr. Jha's quick summary of what the situation is. And very interestingly, he mentions freedom of speech is in fact the engine for the investigation of truth. And that's something which I think all of us resonate with. But as I am, sort of reminiscing this emotion, I am also reminded of the theory of Shadada, that truth is always relative, it changes with context. In a multicultural and a pluralistic society like India, do you think that the advice that be thick-skinned is something which we can afford? In the vicious cycle of them, hurling levels, accusations against the other, and this going in a complete cycle where in the search of truth, we continue to condemn one community and the other community condemns the other, and it goes into a cycle. So any of the panelists are free to answer this question, and we'll of course, take it from there.
Can I just say one thing? I've got 4 or 5 points, but I will restrict myself to one right now. See, when we're talking about hate speech, let's give some examples. Supposing someone says, and this was said in early 20th century or even before that, in India, Indians and dogs not allowed. And it's a big hoarding. And it says it clearly. That I think is hate speech, right? Supposing someone says Indians go back to India in England, or if someone says Muslims go back, or we've heard this, Musalman ka ek hi sthan, Kabristan ya Pakistan or something like that. I think you are not welcome here. You don't belong here. You are excluded from us. You're not us. We don't welcome you. Now, these are instances very clearly of hate speech. So let's just get this right. It's not saying one person saying something against another person or against another person's religion in small contexts. No, there is a pervasiveness in the whole society about a view which is very demeaning to other people. That's what is hate speech. And it's that which where is truth here? the point that Rajkamal made about free speech being an engine of truth. What is the truth here which free speech is trying to identify? There isn't any truth here. This is a direct attack on a very important public good of your society, which is inclusiveness, solidarity, fraternity, call it communal harmony, whatever. This is a very important public good. We value it, and there is a direct attack. This is not just a matter of individual offense. Likewise, you see, I think we must make at some points of time, the general climate in our society reaches a point where any small remark which is made against others by one community to another, against another community, can quickly be seen as contributing to an intolerant society, right? I mean, a society which is full of hatred and enmity. We are actually promoting that. Now, in that, if such an inflammatory atmosphere is there, then some statements, any statement, even a mild statement, can become dangerous. Deepak mentioned a politician saying, a book which is critical, say, about another religion is written by an academic. It is written moderately, but and it is because it's written by an academic and in an academic context, the arguments are all made in a moderate tone and so on. But if a politician picks it up and at the time of elections uses it and says it in a certain tone, he's doing something with it which is very different from what the academic is doing. So speech is also an act through speech, and therefore just focusing on the content is not enough. We have to also see what the person who's using that speech, who's making that speech, what is he doing with that? Is he causing deliberate damage to the social fabric of our society? Is he trying to inflame innocent people, ill-informed people? What is that person trying to do? So intention, again, is not something that is in the heads of individuals. It is there inscribed in certain practices, certain historical practices, and one can, again, this leads us back to the social context in which that intention is inscribed. And so something which is not very hateful or inflammatory, said in a context where already there is a threat to violence, said by somebody who is very powerful and has a hold on people in general, say a politician in an election rally, all that, suddenly would make even that mild statement very, very dangerous, and it should be restricted, right? So I think I have several other points, but I would like to, I thought I should make this because I think some of our discussion probably was in, the hate speech, under the term hate speech, we're trying to cover a lot of things, but
right. Absolutely. Yeah. Professor Vargav, so just adding on further, if I were to sort of question or probe this further, do you think that this tolerance which you speak of, is that tolerance also very variedly responded by the state? Do you think certain comments, I mean, we in international law use the term margin of appreciation, where the state perhaps, do you think certain comments are not responded to in the same manner as certain other comments which are made against a separate community?
Well, that is a separate issue of partiality and impartiality. But I would like to just make a little point. I mean, I agree with a lot of things that Deepak said, but I'd just like to make this, what was it? I forget now. Something that I thought of making about
numerical superiority and franchise. I think that's what you're coming.
Well, that also. I mean, on this minority majority.
Right.
See, we for a long time we've been ruled. All peoples in the world have been ruled by a tiny minority. They have had the power. Even in our times, we have seen how the whites have ruled over blacks in South Africa.
Correct.
It's always been an aristocratic minority, you know, a dynastic monarchical setup. I mean, this is minority rule, and majority rule in that sense is a very big achievement, because it's a larger number having a say in decision making against minority rule. So what is it that makes a distinction between, how do we define minority and majority today? It's basically defined in terms of power, right? You were right. The powerful and the powerless. What happens in democracies is that generally the powerful are also in the numerical majority. This is something which never was the case earlier. It's only in democracies do numbers and power come together. In other forms of government, they don't. And it is therefore that minority has acquired this connotation of being linked to small numbers. Small numbers by itself cannot make a minority in the sense in which we understand the term. The term minority includes within it a certain degree of powerlessness and vulnerability. The numbers come second. So it's entirely possible that there is a majority of, say, Hindus who are ruled by a very tiny group of Christians or Muslims or Jews or Sikhs, and nobody can justify that. If, you know, on a majority, some laws which come out of the Bible or come out of the Quran are imposed on everybody, that would be horrible. I mean, a violation of a very basic principle or value. On the other hand, today in democratic societies, things have become different. The danger is that a numerical majority, simply because it's larger number, can acquire state power and then impose its own values on other groups, which because of their number are powerless. So I think the context is very important.
I have 2 points to make.
Yes, go on.
Yes. So the first was, I think I agree with Dr. Bhargava on the issue of treating otherization of a group in entirety as a clear red mark, as a red flag. I don't think there is any quarrel with that particular position. Perhaps the only addition that I would like to make to that is that if otherization is couched in religious belief and then sought to be protected as a right to religion, even that would have to be specifically taken up, because then you cannot say that merely because a particular belief is couched in religious faith and therefore it is sanctified, or that form of otherization is sanctified, that particular form of religious free speech and expression is somehow exempt from the red lines with respect to otherization. That may not be acceptable. So my position is clear. If otherization is a red line, regardless of what it is couched in secular free speech or in religious free speech, it must be equally prescribed, because the effect and the intent are the same.
I agree with that.
Grateful. So the second position that I have is that in terms of numerical majorities enjoying a de facto numerical, or let's say a powerful position in a democracy, I think there is one factor that needs to be considered there, which is the question of, let's say, conscious belief in a particular identity. Therefore, assume for a moment that Muslims in Birmingham are much more conscious of their position as Muslims and therefore choose to act as a unit compared to the non-Muslims or perhaps the Christians, so to speak, who don't vote as a particular group or do not vote their identity, then it is not just a question of numerical majority or minority that defines the power equations. It also is a function of how consciously do they take their identity to the extent that it informs their political choice. Okay, so I think in a democracy, a straightforward assumption that a party or let's say a group which is in the majority always translates to enjoying better political power may not work. And secondly, from a constitutional perspective, the Constitution does not recognize the concept of a national majority or a national minority. It recognizes the concept of provincial majorities and provincial minorities, because this has been the history of the discussion right from the 1916s and 1917s and 1920s. When the question of self-government and Swaraj started, the discussion was primarily provincial and then followed by the government of India. Because I'm just in the process of finishing the second book and I just managed to read the 1923 resolution of the Muslim League in Lucknow, which was a continuation of its 15th session, which was adjourned sine die in Delhi first and then it continued, wherein the specific position taken there, and this was drafted by Mr. Jinnah, was the issue of preserving provincial majority status of communities in the respective provinces. So he identified NWFP, Bengal and Punjab as the provinces where the Muslim majority must be preserved under any circumstances, and they cannot be changed either through law or through social transactions versus clear position. So therefore, my point is, from the perspective of the Constitution, I would desist from applying a national prism and would apply a state prism, because at the end of the day, we look at reservations from a state perspective, which is to say a provincial perspective. We look at backwardness and everything else from a provincial perspective. And we are looking at representation and empowerment primarily from a local perspective, because you're looking at whether a particular community stands to be represented in the public services, in government sector, in the social life, in a particular place where it lives. And therefore, the immediate question is state and not the center. The infusion of a national minority principle has come primarily through international conventions, which India has signed much later, after the coming into force of the Constitution in the 90s during the Mandal period, without ever asking itself. Yes, please. Yes, please.
I'll forget, some of the points, because, and of course, others have to come in as well.
Yeah.
But I think in Articles 26 to 29, you would know better, there are certain community-specific rights. The communities are not mentioned, but there are certain community-specific rights.
Right.
They can be interpreted both provincially and nationally, and there are two communities. There are two criteria on the basis of which these communities are constituted. One is language, the other is religion. We talk about religious minority and linguistic minorities.
Agreed.
Now, the term minorities is used over there.
Right.
It doesn't say that it's whether it is local, state, or national, but it includes both. So the idea of a national minority, we don't use the term nation for any community. We think that is communal, right? We only think of India as a nation and the others are all communities. So let's forget about, yes, we have a convention of not using the term national minorities, but a community, minority and majority, that is something which is there at the national level, all India level. That's constitutionally recognized. That's the first point. The second point is, I'm sorry. There was another point which I'm afraid when we have a long conversation, we tend to, at least I tend to lose the thread of the argument. But I'll remember sometime. I remember some stage and I'll come in. But I think we should let others come in.
Just one response. The very same provisions that you refer to have been the subject of interpretation in TMA Pi as to whether these are national majorities or national minorities and state minorities. Perhaps the position of the Supreme Court there as a 9-judge bench has taken a slightly different view. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I'm open to both.
Yes.
I mean, yes, perhaps we'll take that forward, and maybe we're also conscious of the fact that these theoretical discussions perhaps may not necessarily permeate into how things are functioning or have been functioning, because of, let's put it this way, that a particular majority is perhaps coming and enforcing its own manner of what religious interpretations are and what level of majority it feels should be superimposed. But my question to the panel is that Mr. Deepak spoke about otherization. Do you think that this otherization is being surrogately condoned under the garb of political debate and secular speech in TV shows? And do you think this is being accelerated by the very manipulative stance which the media people are taking? Mr. Jha, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. Look, there is absolutely no debate. You switch on the TV at 9 o'clock, and depending on where you want to go, you see a version of what you just talked about: the otherization, the demonization, and Dr. Bhargav is absolutely spot on that where an entire community is targeted. We saw it, even in COVID, be it COVID or anything you see. And now, the point I would like to make is, of course, that is detestable. It is disturbing. And you're very right. The line is very thin between what that does, how does it increase the temperatures, how it deepens distrust. But who should draw the red lines? Every institution has its own. We saw a political party drawing a red line a couple of weeks ago.
Right.
We have seen institutions drawing a red line. We have seen corporates drawing a red line at times, getting someone to leave or getting some, and we can debate and contest these red lines. So you're very right. Whether it is now, we all know that in June 2022, it is a huge issue, given that somebody who's completely obscure and would never be heard today can videotape himself. And if that is retweeted by somebody who has 1 million followers, he or she reaches a very large number of people, which was not possible technologically even a decade, 10 or 15 years ago. Given this state of play, who draws the red line? And you're very right. At times, it is, is the solution a legal solution? Is it a case by case solution? Is it that we wait for our honorable Supreme Court to put their heads together and say, this is what constitutes hate speech FIR? We don't know. This is completely uncharted waters. And the only example, and I know this sounds like a cop-out, but the only thing we have seen from other democracies at work in their own way is that there is a need to, we have become so polarized that, we vote once in 5 years, but now we are forced to vote once in 5 seconds on social media. We have to take a stand. Are we this or are you that? In this kind of an atmosphere, how do we expand the middle space? Since the larger the middle space, the more expansive the middle ground, that secures free speech. That lowers the temperature on hate speech. What we find now is just the opposite. A huge attempt for electoral reasons, as Dr. Bhargav talked about, or as Deepak talked about, because of history. We see this constant attempt to further put things in, either on both sides of the spectrum, leaving the space in the middle virtually empty. And I think that is a big challenge. And how do we do it? I don't know. We wrestle with that every day. But whether it is the SHO of your local police station who decides whether you should be booked or not, I am not so sure of that at all. I'm also not sure if government is the right set of people to tell us what should be spoken, what should not be spoken. There is a wonderful line from the author Philip Pullman who says that thou shalt not goes to the head, but once upon a time goes to the heart. So should we listen to more stories? Because each one of us has a story, and who decides what can be proscribed? I am not so sure whether it is as easy as bringing an amendment to Article 19.2, to adding a restriction. Deepak talked about, leave it to the states. I am not so sure. When I see what is happening in different state governments, so it is an issue, and I think many of the people here who are legal scholars and legal students will help us find a way out. Yeah.
So speaking about that, Ms. Daruwala, I'll just like to ask you a question. As a lawyer and as a rights activist, do you think that there is a possibility that the anchor who is perhaps deciding or sort of insinuating the speakers to speak a particular line of thought and speak it in a particular manner, could they also be booked under collective intent under Section 34 for the 153 offense or 295A offense or whatever? And the second question which I'd like to ask you is, given that the profitability of their primetime news channel or whatever their show they are showing depends upon viewership, the fact that they would want for insinuatory comments to be made in their channel and during their viewership, is it okay for us to trust them with self-censorship, or should the state not come in? I mean, Mr. Jha just mentioned that the state should not come in and the state should not be telling me what to do and what not to do. Interestingly, under General Comment 34, the Human Rights Committee does mention that it is the state's duty to ensure plurality of opinion. Do you think the state is abridging that role?
There are so many questions in that, and so many people have spoken that, like Mr. Vargav, I'm struggling with my own thoughts. The answer to your anchor question. Look, sometimes when you listen to these anchors in the evening, you just want to shut off the television. And that is a good choice.
Yeah.
It's a good choice to make. And that is a choice I make as an unfettered individual living in a democracy, and also who is a minority. So that is what is spoken is hateful. It is odious, but it is not hate speech in my mind. Okay? And so you're asking a civil liberties person this question, so you probably know these answers. But may I take up some of the other points? Censorship. I am not in favor of heavy censorship of anything, especially things that are so imprecise as to say they are outraging something. You're outraging my modesty. Hey, I'm a woman, I'm a feminist. When are you going to outrage my modesty as opposed to my sister whose modesty might be outraged much earlier? So I think this imprecision is what lets in authoritarianism, what lets in discretion, discrimination, and bad implementation and abuse of power. Those are the things that have to be repaired. Then I just wanted to pick up on something that there were a couple of things. May I continue?
Absolutely, ma'am. Absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead.
See, the word truth. For me, as a boring lawyer, truth is just objective fact. Everything else is your truth, my truth. And like Mr. Jha, I want that marketplace of ideas to be available to 1.2 billion people. In our laws presently, you will see that there is a great privilege given to hurting people's religious sentiments in the area that we're talking about, blasphemy, so on. Religion, state, and now recently women and vulnerable groups, of course, earlier, but that much attention is not paid to it. So there's a kind of privileging of religion, which I fully understand because we are living side by side with many different values. But what we seem to privilege is the ritual and rites, rites as in RITES, around religion, rather than the core of the belief system. And we don't look so deeply at protecting cultural identities, protecting societal spaces. And so what is to be done about that? The other thing is, in this marketplace of this 1.2 billion people who now have, as Mr. Jha points out, you can fling out your opinion anywhere you like and have 1 million people look at it. In this marketplace of ideas, there is also space to call out other people. I don't want government monopolizing that space or telling me this should be called out, but that need not be called out. And then putting all the force of its enforcement behind that idea that it has picked up. So therefore, I am pleading for rationalization of the law rather than and there is, if you look at the Law Commission, the 267th report, I think, somebody, you can correct me, all of you are law students, but I'm looking more at rationalization than stringency. Tell me that a person is making hate speech because it was always his intention to do so. The content shows it, the consequences flowed from it, and it's not about offending you or your community or even the whole samaj. It is about what happened when you said this. So now I have a question that I would like, and I think that if you do this, then you will find a red line is easier to define. And also the discretions that are presently being flung about by the police and the different state people, different state influentials and powerful, will have to come to a stop. But it will never come to a stop if you have a judiciary that is timid, that is diffident, that is looking at other extraneous considerations, like its own relative position to the executive, before it makes decisions. When the person said that 6 years after I have told you that Section 66A should not be activated, how dare you now bring these people in? Why have you not let them out? They didn't go so far as that. Why have you not let them out? If you don't let them out, I will sue you for contempt. I will put you in jail. Slowly, 1 or 2 states, 1 or 2 occasional high courts are doing this. But there is a space for unequivocal loyalty to the constitutional scheme, which is not taking place today. Having said all that, I hope nobody will hold me for contempt, but too bad. Now, my question is to you as an audience. In a democracy, is silence sedition? Is it in the interest of a democratic state? Is it in the national interest, which is the words that we use all the time in sedition cases? Is it in the national interest to stay silent in the face of all of this? Do duty holders who remain silent or compromise What are we to do with them instead of always talking about those who might be in breach of state or might be dissenting or might be free speech, might be, what's the word for it? Hate, might be involved in hate speech, or these professional provocateurs. There are professional provocateurs. What is the state doing about that? In Latin America, they have this notion of where you must protect the Constitution as a whole if you are the Supreme Court or if you are the judiciary. Those things also have to be taken into consideration. Sorry, that's it.
Right. So I think an interesting takeaway is ma'am's point of view on how the marketplace of ideas is actually being bulldozed, quite metaphorically, by the state. And perhaps it is, in furtherance of their apparent choice of the objective version of truth, which is most appealable to them. My question is, how is this different from anything which the international community is pressurizing India to do now? When we have the UAE, Qatar, and various other countries coming in and forcing the Indian government to take acknowledgement of the condemnation of whatever was said, how is this any different? Yes, Ms. Arwal.
Sorry, thank you. You provoked me into just saying something more. The way that you pose the question is a little bit like Mr. Arnab Goswami and his whataboutery. Forgive me for
I'm learning
such
from
a
the
terrible comparison. But look, too often we are silenced by false equivalence or whataboutery. They said, so we can also say. Look, they got us that time, now we'll get them this time. And therefore, both of them is okay. It is not. In a democracy, some ideas are definitely better and more virtuous than others because they deepen the constitutional values, the dignity of the individual, the dignity of communities, the safety and security of society, and others are oppressive, create enmity, intimidation, outright evil. Hate speech divides. Yes, it does. But every opinion divides. Yet not everything that divides, as I mentioned, or denigrates is hate speech. So the limits of restriction, as well as the moral compass, has to be taken account of when we do this whataboutery or this equivalence.
My question to the panelists is, do you think that I'm sorry, 1 second. Yes, Mr. Deepak has a point to make. I'm so sorry I couldn't get you in.
No, not at all. I'm just looking at the watch. I'm so sorry. Please carry on. Make your point.
No, my question was, I was just, I think Ms. Daruwala was quite right in mentioning that both these versions are wrong. In fact, it is the state's duty, like I mentioned under General Comment 34, where the Human Rights Committee emphatically requests the state to bring in plurality of opinion so that there is a holistic idea at growth and there is a holistic opportunity at the development of mental faculties in order to embrace a more sustained way of life and things like that. But my question is further in furtherance of the ideas which we just upheld and the ideas which we just discussed. So how do we, coming back to Mr. Jha's idea that people should be thick-skinned and that people should not be offended at the slightest opportunity, how should we move forward in sort of inculcating and imbibing these values upon our citizenry and maybe the global citizens, of course? Yes, Mr. Deepak.
So I'll take the recent episode as one of the examples without getting into the specifics of it and without feeling the need to share my views on what was said. I will focus only on this. I think the state failed utterly and terribly in curbing the outrage after that particular statement. And therefore, across the board, I think state governments and whichever government is responsible has completely allowed this particular episode to create what I would call a chilling effect in the language of Shreya Singh. So the point here is, apart from, so one of the ways that the state facilitates plurality of opinions is not just by strengthening free speech in a positive way, but also creating a deterrent for people who stifle free speech. And in that particular regard, this is a textbook instance, and I've said so as much in an unfortunate TV debate, of state impotence. This is perhaps where the state needs to assert its monopoly over force. And these were terrible scenes. So just to add to the point that you made on TV debates, as someone who unfortunately gets called for some of these debates, let me tell you what happens. The guest coordinator first asks you, sir, aapka position bataiye. Is taraf hai ya us taraf hai? I'm not on either side. I have a different position. No, not allowed. Because they need to run the ticker on the top of your head saying for and against. You need to therefore come out with a clear position. Okay. And when you're trying to make a point and a soft point at that, or you're trying not to shout over the other, you'll hear the gentleman constantly shouting in your ear, sir, aur zor se boliye, sir, aur chillaiye, sir, warna aapka suna nahi jayega, sir. This is how these TV debates are conducted, which is why for certain channels I have said, mujhe baksh do, I'm not going to be part of any of these discussions. I'm not interested. But the one thing that I certainly have to make is that in terms of a point, the Supreme Court was very, very clear, especially after the 66A judgment, that the rarefied atmosphere in which the Supreme Court functions is not the rarefied atmosphere in which the SHO beat constable works. That's one. Therefore, the nature of this discussion, and I'm not an elitist, I'm sorry, I'm not an elitist, should not be confused and should not be equated with the quality and the nature of discussions that happens at different levels. And as much as you don't like it, and as much as it sounds, how do I put it, classes to make this point. I'm sorry, I come from a low class family. I don't have an iota of classism. All I'm trying to say is this. The state needs to wield the stick at certain places which it has fundamentally failed to. The existence of a state and the social contract that the lathi will be in the hands of one person who's been given the authority to do so has been completely reneged. So the law can take its own course with respect to statements made. But people do not have the right to come out to the street and then wage war against themselves and the society. That cannot be permitted under any circumstances. And I think this position has not changed regardless of the disposition or dispensation.
Right. With that, I think we'll wait for closing comments from any of the panelists, and we'll just quickly move to about 10 minutes of questioning. Professor Vargav.
I think this is I think the impartiality of the state, I would agree with Deepak. I think the most important thing here is the impartiality of the state. The state should act in a just manner. It should not favor any one person, group, community over the other. And it's very important for the government, particularly in relation to the police, to ensure that the police acts in an impartial manner. So I think once that impartiality is assured, I agree entirely that the state should wield the stick when it comes to people setting buses on fire. Demonstration is a different matter. People are free to protest and come together and publicly protest about anything which they feel strongly about. But to take the law in your hands to damage public property, that invites a completely different, that goes into a completely different arena. It's a criminal act, and it should be dealt with and prevented by police and by. That's one point. The second point I wanted to make was a lot of the times we raise this question who's to draw the line. I think all of us have a stake in it. It is not up to the government. Don't forget, in democracies, the government is there as a temporary custodian of the public good. It's not there forever. It should not take decisions which have an impact, a long-term impact. It is not, the government has to preserve what has happened in the past as much as to bring about changes with the consensus of everybody. I think we have forgotten checks and balances today. I think there is too much concentration of power in the government. I think other institutions must chip in. The media must chip in. The intellectuals must say something. It's all of us. It's everything depends on multiple agents, not on a single agent. So, of course, the government has a role to play, but it is only one of the actors. There are many actors. There's an alert citizen. There are civil society activists. There is the judiciary. There is the media. There is the bureaucracy. There are the teachers, the educators, those who have responsibility of teaching all our students, and various other stakeholders. All of them have to come together, and the where the threshold is not going to be decided in a day. Why did we have the Constitution? Because we wanted certain parameters to be set for a much longer time, right? And changes were made slowly with amendments, not with any kind of revolution. Having the Constitution was a revolutionary act by itself, a peaceful act of revolution. And I think we should maintain the dignity of that. Today, long-term decisions are being made at the whims and fancies of a people. That is something which is not very healthy, because that's that way. When new people come to power, they will do exactly the same thing. We're setting a very bad trend. I don't think a society can flourish or grow, and a nation can become, worthy of its place in the world if we continue to let this happen. So, of course, we should draw the red line. I think there should be a debate about where the deadline should be drawn, and all of us should be part of that debate. No single person or no single institution should be allowed to decide.
Right. So just, adding on from that, I see a very interesting question in the chat box also. I'll link it to what Professor Vargav just mentioned. And Professor Vargav mentions that the dichotomy in finding the red line is perhaps aggravated by the concentrating powers of the government. And this concentrating power of the government is perhaps translating to a very unseeming trend on social media, where the government is acting as fact finders and fact checkers. And we see the police commenting, and the question goes like, do you think with the government and government agencies like the police acting as fact-finding bodies, the version of truth which will emanate from such an exercise will perhaps be an exercise in choice of the government as to which version of truth most suits them? Anyone? Do we have? Yes, Mr. Deepa.
See, I don't think, notwithstanding our professions of constitutionality, since we live in a real world, the hope is that political biases which have a tendency to color facts, forget the truth, those tendencies are meant to be curbed by that one institution that is meant to act as the filter, which is the judiciary. And that's precisely why the hope is, and the purpose of, and the intention behind judicial independence is to act as that particular pass-through filter. Now, this ties into what Ms. Darwala mentioned earlier, that a perhaps more, let's say, unequivocal position which is taken with respect to state action, regardless of the dispensation, and regardless of, let's say, interinstitutional, let's say, stakeholdership or their equations. If those equations don't color outcomes in these matters, then you might find a better line being drawn, or at least a clearer line being drawn by the judiciary, whose job it is as far as this issue is concerned. So to tie 3 points, Mr. Jha, his question was, who draws the line? Dr. Bhargava says, all of us are stakeholders. I agree. I completely agree. Everybody who feels the need to voice his or her opinion on social media is not only exercising a right, but is also carrying a certain burden along with it, a certain responsibility along with it. I agree. But since you don't expect drivers on a road to use their free will entirely, and you need a traffic signal at the end of the day, notwithstanding how civilized a particular society is, the traffic signal its function is performed by the judiciary insofar as a constitutional democracy is concerned. And therefore, to some extent, assuming for a moment that the cynicism with which we look at politicians and the political establishment fully justified, then the only other institution to which you can look up to for some kind of guidance happens to be the judiciary. And there, whether it is sending a message to the police establishment or the political establishment, it again falls on the judiciary to do it, because it seems to constantly call itself the watchdog of the Constitution. Then it might as well live up to that particular reputation and discharge its duty. I think that's where the buck starts as far as this particular situation is concerned.
Right, that's a very interesting take, and I think a more pragmatic view of the idea, and we hope that that sort of situation continues and we see an exercise against such an abuse of discretion and concentration. The next question is a very interesting question, and this question is directed at Mr. Jha. And the question goes...
Is there anything, is there some disturbance?
Yeah, there's some audio.
Sound?
Dipanshu, is there some disturbance?
So I guess it's not clear. It's like from, I guess, Maja's mic is echoing. So maybe...
No, do not blame it on Maja ma'am.
I think so.
I think there, as long as Avantik wasn't having his earphones.
I do. Sir.
What's the
I have my
disturbance?
headphones connected. Is this better? I have my headphones out now. Is this better?
Now I guess it's better.
Okay, that's
Exactly. Now it's better. Yeah.
I was about to it. I'm so sorry. But the question goes to Mr. Jha, and the question is, while when the press is reporting incidents of hate speech, do you think there's an ethical responsibility of tuning down the narration of events, where you try to like quell further disturbance by eventually not giving out what exactly was stated, but trying to maybe like censor it a little bit for a more pragmatic reception of whatever was said?
I really wish we could do that. Look, this has been Miss Daruwala's thing about switching the remote off is a very powerful solution. Now, the thing is, we do use our editorial judgment when we are reporting on a speech. Now there is almost standard operating procedure in the Express newsroom that when a public figure makes a speech that is controversial, or we think can and is read in different ways by the different readers who come to Indian Express, we say, please quote the speech in the language it was written, and then give a fairly accurate translation in English. But so if it is Hindi, we do write it in Roman script, but we do write it in Hindi ad verbatim from the tape. But the issue is, as all of us have realized, and Deepak talked about, and I think that's a very, very important point of judiciary being the last filter, because there are no filters. Big tech in Silicon Valley says, do not tell me to play editor. I am just a platform. Don't hold me responsible for what people put on the technology I give. So in that case, when you say that should the media be more responsible, of course it should. But I think the ship has sailed far beyond that now. Indian Express or any other paper, we can be very responsible and report on a speech, but by the time we do that speech in its complete, with its noise, in its entirety, is there on Twitter and Facebook and WhatsApp groups. It is spliced and diced. Sometimes it is photoshopped and doctored. And there are these voices. And so further reinforcing the point that all of the other speakers have made, that the judiciary, the independent judiciary, whose job it is to secure that middle space for us, to speak, to get ourselves heard, does its job.
Right.
somebody talked about, the anchor at 9 o'clock. I would make the, sort of, why just the anchor? Why not the person who pays his or her salary? I'm sure they know what the anchor is doing. Since, when have these people ever been asked to participate in a debate on free speech? Those who run our TV channels, left, right, whatever. So these are complicated issues, but I think given our long history, we don't have the First Amendment guarantee that the US has, but it's a fact that in the last 40 years, it has been the Supreme Court via a series of rulings that has expanded the space for many of us for the work that we do, and hopefully we will see that happening, and that needs a free and independent judiciary, which is another panel discussion, but the need to secure that independence.
Right. So one second. Of course, we'll keep one final question from Dipanshu directly, who will be asking the question. But there is one final question with which we close this discussion from my end as a moderator, and that question, takes us back to Professor Bhargav's opening comment. And Professor Bhargav started with powerful people should not be touchy about being criticized, firstly, and then he says that powerful people must also be ethically under the duty to ensure that they do not make comments out of place. Now, my question is, do you think there should also, we should have a set of regulations which layers down the responsibility on the basis of your outreach or your political relevance or whatsoever? Should we have that sort of a setup? Maybe, do you think that sort of a setup would be something which would work in India? It's open for anyone to answer.
So will the level of my responsibility depend on my Twitter follow account?
I mean, that's the question I'm asking, because is it going by the intent or the effects rule? I think the effects rule, as you mentioned, sir, the effects rule is something which is directly translating upon the number of people who follow you as well as the outreach you have. So if you take that wrong, do you think we should also be dividing or allocating responsibility on the basis of that?
As a fairly outspoken person, I would resist the application of such a principle for one simple reason, that merely because a greater number of people are listening to me, it cannot translate to a fetter on my ability to say what I think, provided I follow the very same rules of responsible speech, which is to say, responsible speech across the board applies. So therefore, I'm trying to say, assuming for a moment that I have a basis for a particular position that I take, am I expected to tone down the tenor in which I wish to communicate that from T0 to T10 merely because the audience has increased? So, frankly speaking, I would vehemently and vociferously resist the application of such a principle, because that means the more I'm heard, the more I should tone myself down. I would say the position has to be slightly different, which is to say, at least do not be deliberately provocative merely because you have a wider audience. Okay. So I don't think it helps to be a rebel without a cause or an agent provocateur just for the sake of it. Right. But you see, these are moral positions. These are normative positions. And ultimately it boils down to the situation that you're brought up in 100% and the kind of society that you live in. And are you okay getting carried away with the heat of the moment merely because there's a sudden herd mentality and energy that says, everybody is saying this is Bheti Ganga mein main bhi haath dho leta hu. Okay. The moment you do that, then there's a certain problem, because then your reach has a direct effect. But otherwise, my ability to say what I think, provided I have a solid basis for it, cannot be, should not be, and must not be fettered. And the state must be the last entity which resorts to this.
Unless, of course, there's a deliberate intent on your part.
Of course, 100%, 100%.
I think we must make a distinction between people having a wider reach and people who have power. and who use that power to have wider reach. I think with power comes responsibility. There are lots of things that powerful people can do, which ordinary people simply cannot do. They don't have the power. I can't stop a riot. Some powerful people can stop a riot. I'm helpless about. I mean, I'm able to do only certain things in my very restricted sphere, and I have to be responsible there. But I can't be responsible for what is happening in the whole society. But powerful people need to be responsible. So I think I take this business of asymmetries of power very, very seriously. With power comes responsibility, and yes, there is a lot of restraint that has to come with power. Certain things that people, I mean, Deepak talked about fetters. I would say that there are fetters. I mean, judges, for example, in public do not say so many things. They can't say things that they can say privately. And very often they don't even say things privately because they think that it might be misconstrued. So I think the parents do that all the time in their families. They don't say certain things in front of their children. I mean, this is something which is, again, basic common sense. And I think we should follow that. There is no doubt in my mind that with power comes responsibility, and with responsibility comes self-restraint. We expect people in power to prevent certain things from happening and to encourage the building of a free and open society. If they don't do that, we will hold them responsible for it.
And just to jump in, sorry, no, just to jump in. Can I jump in?
Yes, absolutely. So
yeah, just to jump in here to what Dr. Vargav talked about, the imbalance of power, and it's a fact that lies at the heart of what we are talking about, and given if we can frame it in the way that those who have the power to deny you your constitutional rights as an individual, now they should have a thicker skin than the individual citizen, which means those who have the power to fire you, those who have the power, as Dr. Bhargav talked about, to stop a riot, those who have the power to call up the head of an agency or a thana to get its wheels moving. That's the definition of power that we have, and to put curbs on those power. When we say, it is very fashionable these days to say, it is a wonderful thing to speak truth to power, but to what kind of power? So I think maybe one starting definition for power would be that power that has the right to put you in fetters. And I think to call that power out in a free and frank manner and to protect that right would be a good place to start.
Just to telescope that point and maybe add, if not a proviso, perhaps another category is that you strike a distinction between holders of office / aspirers for office versus influencers in an informal sense who command a certain reach. Okay, so the yardstick and the benchmark or the metrics that you choose to apply to holders of office or people who aspire to occupy a particular office cannot be applied to social media influencers, which is a current day phenomenon, right? That may be different because at least when it comes to social media influencers, the one thing is they seem to be beholden to their image and their popularity to a significant extent, which is both an incentive as well as a disincentive in itself. Right? Unless, of course, you're completely reckless and you say, I'll keep shouting as long as they listen. And even if they don't listen, I keep shouting. Then that's a different ballgame altogether. But there, the up and down, so to speak, comes from the acceptance from the audience itself, which listens to you. But as far as holders of office are concerned, there is an inherent presumption of power thanks to the position that they hold, right? And therefore, I extend that principle even to those people who may not be in power, but who are stakeholders to the power establishment by way of being, let's say, people who aspire and contend for the particular position.
Absolutely.
So that is the distinction that I would strike.
Interesting. Yeah.
Right. Ms. Daruwala, would you like to present or like mention anything? Right. So Ms. Daruwala has sort of concurred with the opinion which was shared. And of course, Ms. Daruwala's insight or something which we all hold on to. And yes, Dipanshu has a last question. And I'd like to...
Yes, I guess Daruwala ma'am has to say something.
Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am.
Yes.
No, I have nothing to say. I'm very happy. Thank you.
Right. So with that, I'd like to, with that, one second. With that, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to all the panelists, and thank you so much for this engaging discussion. And we have like Dipanshu's very important question, and after which the floor is.
Yes, sir. Sir Samrid, the member of CCLCV, will ask the question. Samrid.
Yes, Samrid. Go ahead, Samrid. Go ahead, you're audible.
So my question is to Deepak sir. Sir, in your first book, you have extensively talked about an Indic OIT to look at constitution and civilization from an Indic light. So considering the issue we have at hand today, what would an Indic OIT shedding light on constitution and other basis, what position would it have? And should we also relook the post-enlightenment Voltairean principles which we try to put upon on India and expect people to uphold it? Thank you.
So I have consciously chosen to not draw my principles from the Enlightenment, because that's the position I've taken in the book, because it has its own set of problems. And the position that I've taken is that whether it's for the good, the bad, or the ugly, you have options for all three from Bharat's own experience. I'm not therefore saying close your mind to options from outside or ideas from outside, because that would go against the very principle in the philosophy of the Upanishads. That's not my position. However, perhaps there is an unorthodox example to be given here, which I think Salman Rushdie quoted as part of his discussion with Christopher Hitchens in one of his conversations, where he specifically said that there was a position in Indra Sabha which is reserved for anyone who wants to use the podium to criticize anyone else. Okay. And I remember having come across a similar point in a discourse by Dr. Bharat Gupta, who is one of the, let's say, legends of Natya Shastra still surviving, and whose works I think you should read, because Natya Shastra is not just about dance, but it's about expression and free expression. And he makes this very same point. But you see, when you choose to apply these precious principles, you cannot do so in isolation without asking yourself whether the society is ready for it in general. Okay. The reality of India, you want to call it Bharat or whatever today, is that it is chaotic. And when I say today, I just don't mean today. I mean, as it stands over the last 70 years, it's been fairly chaotic, with its own sense of self, muddled in a significant way. So as far as I'm concerned, left to myself, if I have to put together the first principles of what applies to free speech, then I would want to draw from principles of Natya Shastra to a significant extent. Now, the second part of your question relates to whether these principles have influenced the crafting of the Indian Constitution insofar as Article 19 is concerned. To that, my answer is I don't know yet, because I'm yet to finish that particular research, and that will be only part of the third book. Okay, so it's a trilogy. So the second part ends with the Khilafat movement of December 1924. It ends there. In fact, the manuscript is just gone out. So as far as your specific question is concerned, it's not an opinion-based question, it's an evidence-based question. So allow me to respond to this as part of the third book, because that will be certainly one of the heads as part of the Indian Constitution, which defines Bharat's identity, which I will deal with as to whether it drew from Indic, let's say, perspectives, or did it draw significantly from Enlightenment ideals. Okay, that I don't have an answer to, unfortunately. Okay.
So should we try to do a TV debate and coerce you into an answer right now?
No, please don't.
Then you'll get absolute nonsense. That much I guarantee.
So the floor, thank you.
Unfiltered nonsense.
Thank you everyone for being like a brilliant.
Thank you so much.
Panshu,
Yes, sir. Yeah, so we are having so many questions. So as a director, it would be a duty like to invite every of the esteemed panelists separately and to have just interact with the audience. Like we are getting more than 50 questions and more in the YouTube chat box. So we'll definitely love to do a separate session with each of the esteemed panelists. And it was really thought-provoking. I would also request Samrit to give an official vote of thanks on behalf of Center for Criminal Law, Criminology and Victimology. I would like to heartily thank all the esteemed panelists, Avantik sir, as well as the members of the audience for such a pleasant discussion. Thank you so much. Over to you, Samrit.
You could send the questions to us by email.
Definitely,
We'd
sir.
like to know what the questions were.
Definitely, sir. Definitely, sir. We'll do that.
Yeah, thanks.
Yes, Samrit, please.
Samrit, we are waiting to be thanked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was unable to unmute. So perhaps I don't have to speech. But to start with, I'm extremely honored and delighted to offer the vote of thanks on behalf of CCLCV in particular and NUJS at large. At the start of it, I'd like to thank our Honorable Vice Chancellor for allowing us to move ahead with this discussion and being very enthusiastic about the entire event. We have received a lot of recommendations and suggestions from him, which we have put to use here. A second thanks would be to all the esteemed guests present here. I've seen a very enriching from which all the students and the viewers joining would be able to take back a lot. We are especially indebted to everyone joining in this Saturday evening and telling us all the brilliant ideas of their mind. And I would also like to specifically point out Sir Raj Kamal Jha for joining us from Toronto at this point of time and gracing us with his presence. I would like to thank Professor Avantik Tamta, who has been a brother for us and also a guide, especially clearly moderating this panel very well. Next, we would thank our professors, Ma'am Kavita and Mr. Surja, for being very, very helpful throughout this debate, throughout this panel discussion. And in the preparation for that, they have been who are the unseen and the untold here, but have worked really hard to make this event come into culmination. I would like to thank, lastly, but most importantly, Mr. Dipanshu Agarwal, who is a fifth-year student at NUJS and the director of CCLCV. He has been extremely working hard for this, and we have seen this event come to light because of a lot of his efforts. And lastly, thank you all, the guests, the panelists, and also the viewers who have turned up enthusiastically and have enriched the entire discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Bye.
It was a pleasure.
I don't think your TRP ratings are going to go up. Your panel was much too civilized.
I will keep that in mind like next time, ma'am. Ma'am, in fact, I'll be in touch with you if you could come and speak to my students on the issue of rights further.
I'd be more than happy to. But you have to give me a lot of notice. That's all.
I will give you a
Sure, ma'am. I will definitely love to hear you separately on issue of civil liberties, specifically human rights.
I'm more than happy to.
Because we have a subject on international human rights law, which sir himself states. So we'd love to engage in more discussion regarding that.
Yeah, but you know, long ago I left book learning, as a result of which I can never teach students because they are so good with article so and so and general comment 44, and I'm like, what? But if you can educate me on that, I would love to do it.
Ma'am, you're being humble again. But
No, I'm not. I really I don't fancy myself as anything more than someone who is, really passionate about civil liberties, but also I like to think of myself as a little bit practical in the sense of, we were talking today about freedom of speech and expression and all that. How are you going to get any kind of safety and security for all the rights that you have if your police are, instead of